There's a photograph worth sitting with for a second. A British Prime Minister, silver-haired, immaculate, standing in front of a canal that isn't even in his country, giving the order to send tanks into a nation Britain doesn't own, to protect a waterway Britain doesn't legally control anymore. That man is Anthony Eden. The year is 1956. And within weeks, his career, his health, and something much bigger than either of those things, Britain's ability to act as a great power, will collapse in the desert heat alongside his tanks. We're not starting there, though, because if you only look at 1956, you miss the real story. You miss the fact that Britain didn't lose the Middle East in a single crisis. It lost it in stages over roughly 70 years through wars it started, coups it ran, promises it broke, and a currency it couldn't defend. And what replaced that empire wasn't nothing. It was something quieter, stranger, and in some ways still standing today, tucked into naval bases and arms contracts most Americans have never heard of. So let's actually trace it, not the myth, the record. The empire that was never supposed to exist asterisk. Here's something that surprises people. 110 years ago, Britain didn't really have a Middle East empire at all. It had Egypt, sort of. As a protectorate, it had ceased to guard the Suez Canal, and it had oil interests in Persia. That was basically it. The modern map, Iraq, Jordan, the borders that still draw blood today, that map didn't exist. It was invented on paper during the First World War by men who had mostly never set foot in the region. In 1916, while the war was still raging, two diplomats named Mark Sykes of Britain and François Georges-Picot of France sat down and secretly carved up the collapsing Ottoman Empire's Arab territories into zones of British and French control. France would get Syria and Lebanon. Britain would take the rest of Iraq and a slice of Palestine. It was done in pencil, essentially, with almost no regard for the ethnic, religious, or tribal makeup of the people who actually lived there. And it stayed secret, because Britain had already promised something contradictory to two other groups. To Arab leaders, through a series of letters known as the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, Britain had promised support for an independent Arab kingdom if they rose up against the Ottomans, which they did. And then, in November of 1917, in a short letter from Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour to a British Jewish leader named Lord Rothschild, Britain also promised to support, in its own words, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Three separate, overlapping, mutually incompatible commitments made to three different audiences, all converging on the same strip of land. When the war ended and the secret Sykes-Picot deal became public, courtesy of the Bolsheviks publishing it out of Russia's old archives, the sense of betrayal among Arab nationalists was immediate, and it never really faded. Out of this mess came the mandate system. The League of Nations handed Britain formal control over Iraq and Palestine, dressed up as a temporary trusteeship meant to guide these territories toward eventual self-rule. In practice, it was colonial administration with new paperwork. Britain installed a monarchy in Iraq in 1921, putting a man named Faisal, who wasn't even from Iraq, on the throne, a Hashemite prince who'd been kicked out of Syria by the French. Britain kept its hand on Iraqi oil, kept air bases on Iraqi soil, and kept the right to move troops through the country whenever it wanted. In Palestine, Britain tried to manage both its promise to the Zionist movement and its promise to the Arab majority already living there, and largely failed at both, presiding over rising communal violence for the better part of 3 decades. The empire of oil and thrones. By the 1920s and 30s, Britain's Middle East position rested on something more durable than mandates and treaties. It rested on oil and on the throne rooms of client monarchs. In Persia, later renamed Iran, Britain had secured an oil concession back in 1901, and by 1908 the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, later renamed Anglo-Iranian, and eventually becoming the company known today as BP, was pulling enormous wealth out of the ground. The terms were brutal for Iran. Britain took the overwhelming share of the profits while paying Iran a royalty. In some years, the British government's own tax revenue from the company actually exceeded what it paid the Iranian state in royalties. That is worth sitting with. Britain's treasury made more money off Iranian oil than the Iranian government did. Iraq had a similar arrangement through the Iraq Petroleum Company. Egypt had the canal, controlled by a British and French-run company, and British troops garrisoned along its banks. And across the smaller Gulf states, sheikdoms like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the string of territories known as the Trucial States, Britain operated what historians now call an informal empire. These weren't colonies in the classic sense. They were protectorates, ruled by local sheiks who kept their thrones because Britain guaranteed their security, and in exchange, Britain controlled their foreign policy and increasingly their oil. This was the high-water mark. Britain didn't just have influence in the Middle East. For roughly 3 decades, Britain effectively decided who ruled in Baghdad, who ruled in the Gulf, and what happened to the oil beneath their feet. It's worth pausing on one more piece of this arrangement, because it explains something people often get confused about later: why some of the monarchies Britain installed survived, while others didn't. Alongside Faisal in Iraq, Britain also placed Faisal's brother, Abdullah, on a newly invented throne in what was then called Transjordan. That kingdom, unlike its Iraqi counterpart, endured. It exists today as the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, still ruled by the same family, still one of Washington's most reliable Arab partners. The difference wasn't luck. Jordan had less oil to fight over, a smaller and more manageable population, and a ruling family that proved considerably more adept at building genuine domestic legitimacy than its Iraqi cousins ever did. It's a useful reminder that British-engineered monarchies weren't uniformly doomed. Some of them adapted and outlived the empire that created them. Others didn't. Kuwait tells a related story. Britain had held a protectorate relationship over Kuwait since 1899, again primarily to keep rival powers, first the Ottomans, later others, away from the head of the Gulf. When Kuwait became formally independent in June of 1961, Iraq's government under General Abd al-Karim Qasim, the very man who had overthrown the Hashemite monarchy 3 years earlier, immediately claimed Kuwait as historically Iraqi territory and moved troops toward the border. Britain rushed forces back into the Gulf within days to deter an invasion, a brief, almost forgotten episode that nonetheless previewed, with uncomfortable precision, exactly what would happen without any deterrent 3 decades later, in 1990, when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Kuwait outright and dragged the United States into the Gulf War. The first crack, Palestine, 1947–48. The first serious blow to this system came from the mandate Britain had actually pursued most reluctantly. By the mid-1940s, Palestine had become ungovernable. Jewish immigration had surged following the Holocaust. Arab resistance to that immigration was hardening, and Britain, financially devastated by the Second World War, could no longer afford the troops or the political cost of holding the territory together. In 1947, Britain announced it would hand the Palestine problem to the newly formed United Nations, and in May of 1948, British forces withdrew entirely. Within hours, war broke out between the new state of Israel and its Arab neighbors. It's easy to miss how significant this was at the time. Britain hadn't been driven out by an Arab army or a rival empire. It had simply concluded the mandate wasn't worth the cost anymore and walked away, leaving behind a conflict that is, at the time I'm recording this, still unresolved more than 75 years later. The pattern that would define the rest of the century had already appeared: Britain overextending itself, then retreating under financial pressure, and leaving behind a vacuum that someone else would have to fill, often violently. Iran, 1953. The empire tries one more move. If you wanted proof that Britain still believed it could shape the fate of Middle Eastern governments by force, even after Palestine, You'd find it in Iran in 1953. And this episode matters because it shows the transition happening in real time, from Britain acting alone to Britain needing America to get anything done at all. In 1951, Iran's parliament voted to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The new prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, a secular nationalist who'd become genuinely popular by championing Iranian sovereignty over its own resources, made the nationalization the centerpiece of his government. For Britain, this wasn't just a financial loss. It was viewed in London as an existential threat to British prestige and to the entire model of resource extraction that had underpinned its Middle East position for half a century. Britain responded with an aggressive global boycott, using its shipping and financial networks to strangle Iranian oil exports almost completely. When that failed to bring Mossadegh down, Britain turned to covert action, and crucially it needed the United States to pull it off. British intelligence, MI6, working under the codename Operation Boot, partnered with the American CIA's Operation Ajax to engineer Mossadegh's overthrow. Using bribery, propaganda campaigns portraying Mossadegh as unstable and irreligious, and orchestrated street unrest, the operation succeeded on the 19th of August, 1953. Mossadegh was arrested, and the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had briefly fled the country in panic during the crisis, was restored to full power with Western backing. Within a year, a new international consortium of oil companies, no longer under exclusive British control but shared with American firms, took over Iranian oil production. Notice the shift here. Britain got the outcome it wanted, but only by handing America a permanent seat at the table it used to occupy alone. Iran's oil was saved for the West, but it was no longer Britain's private arrangement. It was Anglo-American, with the emphasis increasingly landing on the American half. And the coup planted a seed of resentment in Iran that would detonate a quarter-century later. In 1979, when the Islamic Revolution swept away the Shah and installed a government that, to this day, defines itself substantially in opposition to both Britain and the United States. Suez 1956, the day the empire's bluff got called. Which brings us to the moment on your screen, the Suez Crisis. By 1956, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had become the face of a new kind of Arab politics, secular, nationalist, and openly hostile to the idea that Western powers still got to decide the region's fate. In July of that year, after the United States and Britain pulled their funding for Egypt's Aswan High Dam project in response to Nasser's growing ties with the Soviet bloc, Nasser retaliated by nationalizing the Suez Canal, the artery through which the majority of Europe's oil supply flowed. Britain and France, who jointly controlled the company that had run the canal, treated this as intolerable. What followed was one of the most reckless gambles in modern British history. In secret meetings at a villa outside Paris in October of 1956, Britain, France, and Israel arranged a plan known as the Protocol of Sevres. Israel would invade Egypt's Sinai Peninsula first. Britain and France would then intervene, publicly framed as neutral peacekeepers separating the two combatants, but privately intending to seize the canal zone and, ideally, topple Nasser altogether. The plan was so sensitive that it was kept hidden not just from the Americans, but from most of the British cabinet itself. Militarily, it worked, at least at first. Israeli forces swept through Sinai. British and French paratroopers and Marines landed along the canal in early November and advanced rapidly. But politically, it was a catastrophe because President Dwight Eisenhower was furious. He hadn't been told. He viewed the operation as a reckless throwback to 19th-century imperialism at the exact moment America was trying to court newly independent nations away from Soviet influence. And he worried it could hand Moscow a propaganda gift in the middle of the Cold War, or worse, trigger a wider confrontation just as Soviet tanks were simultaneously crushing an uprising in Hungary. Eisenhower didn't send troops. He didn't need to. He used money. As the crisis unfolded, international investors began dumping British pounds, triggering a run on sterling. Britain's foreign currency reserves, which it needed to defend the value of its own currency, were draining fast. Eisenhower's administration made clear that American support at the International Monetary Fund, support Britain desperately needed to stop the bleeding, would not be forthcoming unless British and French forces withdrew from Egypt immediately and unconditionally. There was no ambiguity in the message. Britain could keep the canal, or it could keep its currency stable. It could not do both. Britain folded within days. By late November and into December of 1956, British and French forces withdrew from Egypt entirely, having achieved none of their objectives. Nasser, who had been militarily defeated on the battlefield, emerged from the crisis as a hero across the Arab world, the man who had stood up to the old empires and won. Anthony Eden, Britain's prime minister, his health and his authority both shattered, resigned in January of 1957. Suez is remembered as a military campaign, but its real significance was financial and psychological. It proved, in public, in front of the entire world, that Britain could no longer act as an independent great power in the Middle East without American permission. From that point forward, the serious players shaping the region's fate were the United States and the Soviet Union. Britain still had interests there. It no longer had the final word. The ripple effects reached well beyond Egypt. Arab nationalist movements across the region drew a clear lesson from Suez. The old colonial powers could be defeated, not on the battlefield necessarily, but by simply outlasting their political will and exploiting their financial dependence on Washington. That lesson emboldened the officers who would topple Iraq's monarchy less than 2 years later, and it hardened Nasser's own ambitions to export his brand of pan-Arab nationalism to other British-aligned governments across the region. For Britain, the domestic reckoning was just as severe. The Suez affair split the governing Conservative Party, discredited the idea that Britain still belonged among the world's first-ranked powers, and pushed the country toward a national conversation, one that would eventually lead to European integration, about what kind of power Britain actually was now that it plainly wasn't the kind it used to be. Iraq 1958, the throne Britain built gets burned down. If Suez ended Britain's ability to act unilaterally, the next blow destroyed one of its oldest client relationships outright. Remember that monarchy Britain had installed in Iraq back in 1921, putting a Hashemite prince on the throne who had no prior connection to the country. By the late 1950s, that dynasty was still in power, still closely aligned with British and American interests, and still deeply resented by large parts of the Iraqi population as a puppet arrangement dressed up in royal robes. In 1955, Britain and the United States had pushed Iraq into the Baghdad Pact, an anti-Soviet defense alliance that many ordinary Iraqis viewed as yet another instrument of Western control. Then in 1956, King Faisal II openly supported Britain's invasion of Egypt during the Suez Crisis, a decision that further inflamed nationalist anger at home. On the 14th of July, 1958, a group of nationalist military officers calling themselves the Free Officers, led by Brigadier General Abd al-Karim Qasim, moved troops into Baghdad under cover of what was supposed to be a routine deployment toward Jordan. Instead, they seized the capital. The royal palace was stormed. King Faisal II, the crown prince, and the country's veteran pro-British Prime Minister, Nuri al-Said, were all killed within hours. The 37-year-old monarchy that Britain had personally engineered was gone in a single morning, and the Republic of Iraq was declared in its place. The symbolism was impossible to miss. This wasn't a foreign army defeating British forces. It was the very system Britain had built, the throne, the alliance structure, the client relationship, being violently dismantled from within by the people it was supposed to be governing. Iraq would spend the following decades cycling through further coups, ultimately landing under Ba'athist rule and by 1979 under Saddam Hussein. But the starting point of that entire trajectory was the collapse of a monarchy that had existed only because Britain had drawn a border, picked a king, and hoped it would hold. Aden and the birth of East of Suez, asterisk. While Baghdad was falling out of Britain's orbit, another British possession was becoming ungovernable at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. Aden, a strategic port colony at the mouth of the Red Sea, had long been one of Britain's most important military hubs after the loss of British holdings elsewhere, home to Middle East Land Forces headquarters, and a critical link in the empire's global chain of bases stretching to Singapore. Starting in 1963, Aden and the surrounding protectorates were engulfed in what became known as the Aden Emergency, an armed insurgency waged by nationalist and Marxist factions, principally the National Liberation Front, against continued British rule. The fighting escalated sharply through the mid-1960s. In June of 1967, the very local security forces Britain had trained and armed to help control the colony mutinied and turned their weapons on British troops, forcing a temporary retreat from parts of the city. It was, in miniature, the same lesson Iraq had taught 9 years earlier. Institutions built to preserve British control had a habit of eventually being turned against it. Britain withdrew from Aden entirely by the end of November 1967, years earlier than originally planned, abandoning the territory to a chaotic and violent transition that led to the establishment of the People's Republic of South Yemen, the only Marxist state to ever exist in the Arab world. The retreat from Aden landed at almost the exact moment Britain's economy was cracking under its own weight. In November of 1967, the British government was forced to devalue the pound sterling, a humiliating admission of economic weakness. 2 months later, in January of 1968, Prime Minister Harold Wilson's government announced what became known as the East of Suez Decision. Britain would withdraw all of its military forces from bases across the Persian Gulf, Southeast Asia, and the wider region by the end of 1971. The reasoning, as Chancellor of the Exchequer Roy Jenkins argued forcefully inside government, was blunt. Britain simply could not afford to run a global military presence anymore. National greatness, the government concluded, would now have to be measured by economic recovery and Britain's future in Europe, not by how many bases it maintained east of the Mediterranean. Asterisk 1971, the last flag comes down in the Gulf asterisk. The final act of formal British withdrawal played out across the small sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf, territories Britain had protected and quietly controlled for the better part of a century and a half. For decades, Britain had managed the foreign affairs and defense of Bahrain, Qatar, and a cluster of smaller territories along the coast known as the Trucial States, essentially today's United Arab Emirates. When the 1968 withdrawal decision made clear that British protection was ending, it forced these rulers into an urgent and unfamiliar position. They had to figure out how to survive without the guarantor that had underwritten their security for generations. Two of the most influential sheikhs, Zayed of Abu Dhabi and Rashid of Dubai, worked in secret to build a confederation among the smaller territories. With British assistance in the final negotiations, Bahrain and Qatar chose to become fully independent states in their own right, while 6 of the Trucial States joined together, later joined by a 7th, to form the United Arab Emirates. On the 1st of December 1971, the last formal British military presence in the Gulf came to an end. It was, quite literally, the closing of a chapter that had opened not with tanks or invasions, but with 19th-century trade treaties designed to keep other European powers, and later pirates, out of the shipping lanes to India. A century and a half of British protection over the Gulf ended not with a battle, but with a scheduled departure and a handover ceremony. What replaced the empire? Informal influence, not formal control. Here's where the story gets more interesting than most people realize, because Britain didn't simply vanish from the Middle East after 1971. What it built instead was a smaller, quieter, more transactional kind of presence, one that has actually persisted in modified form all the way to today. The pattern set in during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, when the Royal Navy established what was called the Armilla Patrol to protect merchant shipping in the Gulf, an operation that, renamed Operation Kipian, continued for decades afterward. Arms sales became the new currency of relationship building. British defense contractors, aircraft makers in particular, cultivated deep and lucrative ties with Gulf monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, ties that persist to this day. Since 2010, roughly 60% of all British arms exports have gone to the Middle East, with Saudi Arabia the largest single buyer, and trade with the Gulf Cooperation Council states now runs at roughly £57 billion annually, several billion of which is defense-related, centered heavily around British Typhoon fighter jets. And in a genuinely striking historical footnote, Britain actually opened a brand new permanent military base in the Gulf in 2018, the UK Naval Support Facility at Mina Salman in Bahrain, its first permanent base east of the Suez Canal since the 1971 withdrawal. Today, Britain also maintains a logistics hub in Duqm, Oman, an airbase presence in the United Arab Emirates, a joint fighter squadron with Qatar's Air Force based out of Al Udeid, and its long-standing sovereign military bases in Cyprus at Akrotiri and Dhekelia, which have served as forward operating platforms for British involvement in nearly every Middle Eastern conflict of the past 3 decades, from the Gulf War to the campaign against ISIS. Those 2 Cyprus bases are themselves a leftover of empire in the most literal sense, sovereign British territory carved out and retained when Cyprus gained independence in 1960, and they still host signals intelligence listening posts that feed directly into British and American monitoring of the wider region. Even the old Aden story never fully closed. The territory Britain abandoned in 1967 eventually became part of a unified Yemen, and in the 2020s, Yemen's Houthi movement, based in the country's north and aligned with Iran, began attacking commercial shipping passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the same strategic choke point Britain once policed as a matter of imperial routine. The Royal Navy found itself back in those waters as part of an American-led coalition, Operation Prosperity Guardian, defending the same shipping lanes it once controlled outright, this time as one contributor among several rather than as the power setting the rules. It's a small but telling illustration of the larger pattern. The geography that mattered to the British Empire still matters today. It's simply that Britain now shows up to defend it as a partner rather than an owner. None of this amounts to empire. It amounts to something closer to a specialized, junior security partnership, valuable to Gulf monarchies who still want Western military relationships, and valuable to Britain as both an economic relationship and a way of remaining relevant in a region it once ruled outright. The borders that never stopped bleeding. There's one more piece of this story that deserves real attention, because it's the piece that still shapes headlines every single week. The borders Britain and France drew in that secret 1916 agreement, and refined through the mandate system that followed, were not designed around the people who actually lived inside them. They were designed around imperial convenience, oil concessions, and rival spheres of influence. Iraq's borders lumped together Sunni Arab, Shia Arab, and Kurdish populations who had no shared national identity, and in some cases, deep historical grievances against one another, inside a single state built primarily to secure access to oil fields and a coastline. The unresolved status of Palestine, left behind when Britain simply walked away from its mandate in 1948 rather than engineering a lasting settlement, remains, more than 75 years later, one of the most intractable conflicts on Earth. Kuwait's borders, drawn in part to prevent Iraq from having a substantial coastline, became the pretext Saddam Hussein used to justify his 1990 invasion, on the argument that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq. You can trace a fairly direct line from decisions made in London offices in 1916 and 1921 to conflicts that dominated American foreign policy and cost American lives generations later in 1991, in 2003, and beyond. This is really the deepest and most uncomfortable legacy of British influence in the Middle East. It isn't really about bases or arms deals anymore. It's about the fact that the basic architecture of the modern Middle East, the map itself, was set by a handful of British and French officials who prioritized their own strategic and commercial interests over the wishes of the people who actually lived on that land. And the consequences of those choices are still working themselves out in real time. What actually happened to the influence? So, to actually answer the question on your screen, Britain's Middle East influence didn't disappear in a single moment. It was dismantled in layers, each one stripping away a different kind of power. The formal empire, the mandates, the client monarchies, the protected sheikdoms, ended through a specific and traceable sequence. Palestine in 1948, Iran's oil relationship broken, and then only partially restored with American help in 1953. The humiliating financial defeat at Suez in 1956 that ended Britain's ability to act alone. The Iraqi monarchy's violent overthrow in 1958. The forced retreat from Aden in 1967. The East of Suez withdrawal decision of 1968. And the final departure from the Gulf sheikdoms in 1971. Each of these was driven less by Arab nationalism alone, and more by a Britain that was economically exhausted, financially dependent on the United States, and increasingly unable to fund the military commitments its imperial habits demanded. What replaced formal control was informal influence. Arms sales, a handful of strategically placed bases, defense partnerships with Gulf monarchies who still find British military cooperation useful, and the enduring, largely invisible legacy of the borders Britain drew a century ago. Borders that continue to generate conflict long after the soldiers who drew them are gone. The uncomfortable truth, the one that rarely makes it into a simple retelling of this history, is that almost nobody involved in dismantling this system thought of themselves as doing anything shameful. British officials in 1921 believed they were bringing order to a chaotic region. The men who negotiated Sykes-Picot believed they were securing legitimate strategic interests during a desperate war. Anthony Eden, even as his gamble at Suez collapsed around him, believed to the end that he was defending Britain's rightful place in the world. They weren't uniquely villainous. They were, for the most part, ordinary statesmen operating inside an imperial worldview that assumed Britain's interests and the region's interests were naturally aligned, right up until the moment reality proved otherwise over and over again for 70 years. And that's really the through line worth remembering. Empires rarely fall in a single dramatic afternoon. They fall the way Britain's did in the Middle East, through a slow accumulation of broken promises, lost wars, currency crises, and client rulers who eventually decided they'd had enough. What's left afterward isn't nothing. It's a residue, a set of habits, relationships, and unresolved borders that keeps shaping the region long after the empire that created them has been reduced to a handful of naval facilities and a flag flying over 2 small bases in Cyprus. There's also a broader pattern here that goes beyond just Britain and the Middle East, one that shows up whenever a dominant power tries to manage a region indefinitely through client rulers and drawn-on-a-map borders, instead of addressing what the people actually living there want for themselves. Sooner or later, the gap between the ruler's interests and the ruled's interests becomes impossible to paper over, and something breaks, a coup, a war, a currency crisis, an insurgency, sometimes all 4 within a single decade. the way it happened to Britain between 1953 and 1971. The Middle East isn't unique in that sense. It's simply the region where the 20th century's version of that pattern played out most visibly, with consequences the world is still living with. If you found this rundown useful, there's a lot more of this kind of deep dive history coming, the stuff that actually explains why the world looks the way it does right now, so it's worth sticking around for it. And I'm genuinely curious where this is landing. Drop a comment and let me know what state you're watching from. I want to see how far this reaches across the country. Which part of this story surprised you the most, Suez, the Iran coup, or the borders themselves? I'll be reading through the comments.